Hello and good morning everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about how to manage your apprenticeship program within a large organisation. Our speakers are today Strategic Commercial Manager Paula Gibson and Stakeholder Partnerships and Policy Manager Bryony Kingsland. And so today's webinar will be covering governance structures, recruitment and attraction strategies, initial assessment, recognition of prior learning, and plus a Q&A session at the end. So please send in your questions via the questions panel, and we'll endeavour to answer most of all your questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll be handing you over straight to Bryony, who will be kicking off today's webinar. Bryony?
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. Thanks for attending. Just a quick question. If someone can put in the chat, you can actually hear us. We have had some technical problems with external bandwidth and hearing us, so I'm hoping that everyone can hear us quite well. If there are any problems, obviously flag it on chat. But without further ado, yes, we'll move forward with the next. Thanks. Sorry, normal technical problems occurring here. There we go. Right. Good. So, the reason that we run these webinars is really part of City and Guild's purpose, is to help people, organisations and economies develop their skills and growth. And that's both our providers who are working with our employers, and also obviously employers directly who are delivering their apprenticeships, either direct or who are working with providers. So the reason that we run the webinars is to make sure that you have got the full up-to-date information about anything that's occurring in terms of change, reform, new policy developments, and in this particular case, looking at how to manage your apprenticeship programme. And we've got an expert here with that. It's Paula Gibson, who's my colleague, who has worked herself in a large organisation setting up an apprenticeship programme, and so she's got all the knowledge and understanding of how what the challenges are with that, so she'll be able to help you with that, and I'm going to help you more with the policy and some of the rules around delivery of apprenticeship programmes. So the agenda today is the context of apprenticeships in large organisation, governance and structures and how they can help support your apprenticeship programme, some hints and tips for recruitment and attraction of really good candidates. We are going to cover recognition of prior learning, because that's an important aspect of apprenticeships that affects both providers who are delivering themselves. It will also affect providers who are, employers who are delivering themselves. It will also affect employers who aren't delivering, because it can have an effect on the apprenticeship you want to deliver, so you need to know about that. Managing training providers, how best to manage a training provider and get the best out of them. Delivering in-house programs, that's if you're an employer provider. Choosing your endpoint assessment organisation. We have got some changes coming up with that over the course of the next year, so it's really important to understand what they are and how they will affect you as employers, because you will have more responsibility for choosing and paying your endpoint assessment organisation towards later on in this year. Celebrating success, and then at the end, hopefully time for Q&A. So let's move on. So, as we all know, hopefully, the levy was introduced in April 2017, and it was made much of because it was meant to create a truly employer-led system, and I think we are heading in that direction. We're probably not fully there yet, but we are certainly heading in the direction of a truly employer-led system, which will give you employers the choice to make to decide which apprenticeships you can deliver, how you use your levy. There has been talk, policy-wise, over the last sort of 6 to 9 months about some flexing in the use of the levy so that you can use it for other things outside of apprenticeships. I think it's an interesting discussion that's ongoing. I can't see anything happening whilst Brexit is occurring, or not occurring, or whatever is occurring with the government, but let's not go there. But certainly, it's something that I think once the current political upheaval has hopefully become less of an upheaval and is more stable, that they will start discussing potentially how the levy could be used apart from apprenticeships. I don't think it's going to happen immediately. Apprenticeships are still bedding in. There are still lots of discussions about the use of the apprenticeship levy and supposed overspend of the levy, which is an interesting one. We'll talk more about that later. So 2 years after implementation, apprenticeship starts and figures have unfortunately continued to decline, and there are questions around the way the funds are collected and used, so that discussion about use of the levy will be an interesting one over the course of the next year. The budget from the Treasury is about 2.1 million. Of this, it appeared that in 2017-18 only 268 million was spent, and yet earlier on this year there were discussions in the media and amongst ministers and amongst DfE officials about the potential of overspend of the levy. a lot of noise from various areas about overspending the levy on the higher level apprenticeships. So I think that's all in the melting pot at the moment. And as an organisation, one of the things that we do keep a very close eye on is what's happening politically, what's happening with policy, and how that will affect both our employers that we work for and the providers that we work with. And so we always make sure that when those things occur, we update you with webinars. So do keep an eye on our website at all times, because when changes are occurring, we will try and give you an overview of what we think is going to happen, what the landscape looks like, and how it might affect you. So in the first year, there was a £400 million underspend. We are very aware that at the moment, as from the 1st of April this year, the government started clawing back unused levy funds. And there was some noise in the media last week about 96 million already being clawed back, which then begs the question, why is there overspend of the levy when we're clawing back 96 million? So I think there's a lot of complex issues there to iron out, and they'll hopefully become more apparent over the course of the next year once the government decides what they're going to do. So what can employers do to make sure they're making the best of their levy and the apprenticeship offer? Well, the next set of slides are really geared towards helping you support that, and now I'll pass you over to Paula, our expert in delivering apprenticeships inside a large organisation. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Bryony. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I think that was a really nice segue, actually, to talk about the context of apprenticeships in a large organisation. I mean, can we actually believe that 96 million is actually being lost in unused levy funds? It really is. It really is a complex issue, and I think this is really what the purpose of this webinar is, to really unpick how large organisations can really make the best of the levy. And having worked inside a very, very large levy paying organisation, hopefully I can share and impart my views on how you can maybe maximise the levy and ensure that you're making the most of it. And interestingly, actually, Brian, I was out at a large employer this week, and they haven't really got to grips with their levy account. So even though we talk about unspent levy, there's a lot of employers out there that are still not even accessing their levy account. So I think it's an interesting
obviously where that 96 million underspend is coming from.
Exactly,
so, yeah.
Exactly. So so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the context. So obviously pre-levy world, within large organisations have been engaging with apprentices for many, many years, especially in engineering, logistics, professional functions. But in the pre-levy world, it was quite easy, I suppose, to do, because you had these discrete functions that would contract with a local training provider. There wasn't really, I think, in big large organisations, an oversight of all the activity that's happening, and there was issues around consistency, delivery methods were different, and having a view on actually what the apprenticeship activity was like across a big organisation was often quite difficult. So when we come into levy world, obviously, because the funding system and the payment system for providers is driving a more centralised approach, I think many large organisations have now started to recruit discrete apprenticeship teams sitting within L&D and HR functions in order to make sure that there's a singular approach to how providers are engaged and used, and how apprenticeships are planned and delivered. And with that, I think, comes almost the need of a governance structure to make sure that there's a planned approach to spending your levy. One of the questions that actually came to us before we launched this webinar today, we sent out the invitations, obviously people can ask questions, was around pipeline for apprenticeships. Well, I'm going to talk about that in the governance slide, so you can really see exactly how to plan for new pipeline and where that sort of governance could come from. And I think, obviously, because the levy is a huge game changer, I think the government anticipated that many large employers would be recruiting new staff. In essence, I think the levy is being used for existing staff, and that's something that I'm going to talk about as well. Performance management, obviously, within large organisations, people need to have an oversight as to how much they're spending. Crucially, for those large employers whose levy pot isn't massive, then clearly they're going to want to know when their levy pot is running out, and any sort of co-investment conversations that they will need to start to consider. So that's the context to where we are. Let's talk about governance structures then. So within large organisations, you would want to have some kind of governance in this sort of context. So the purpose, I suppose, of this model, and this can work for not huge organisations, but in any sort of structure, even within an SME context, I'm sure you could take some some aspects of this. So in essence, I think it's really important that large employers can maximise the extent on which it draws on the levy, as it will accelerate the deployment across the different functions. And actually, with this kind of structure in place, it really is an enabler to wider cultural change. So the aspects, so the role of the steering board, you know, they can be quarterly or monthly, and it really does comprise of your top talent, you know, your top leaders that can represent each functional area. And I think what the role is of the steering board is that they will, you know, they can make the decisions as to whether they go forward or not go forward with a particular apprenticeship programme. I think the critical aspect is the layer below. So these are your project boards, and the project boards look at individual functional areas. They will meet monthly. They will have a view of project progress against the different apprenticeship programs. They will look at the high level risks and issues that could prevent some of these programs from not functioning in the way that they should be. And I think they are the guardian of how some of these programs are designed, because I think what's really important when you're implementing large scale apprenticeship programs is they are fit for purpose within your organisation, and they really pull on some existing training that you might want to map into some of these standards as well. And I think that's where the working group comes in, because they are the doers in a sense. They will meet a little bit more frequently. They will look at the apprenticeship standards. They will align it to the current job roles. They will take a decision as to whether or not that's the right apprenticeship standard. They will look at any of the learning that's happening within the functional area and see whether they can map it into the standard to make it a truly bespoke programme. They will work with the relevant training providers to make sure that the content is fit for purpose. And they will have an oversight on the individual apprenticeship programmes, looking at milestones, risks and issues. They will also be responsible, in my view, in terms of looking at future apprenticeship cohorts as well. So once you say, for example, you've launched a programme in warehousing, for example, then actually they may look at, well, what's the future cohorts look like and what's the recruitment profile look like as well. So I think this kind of structure gives you that entire visibility across the organisation that really looks at every functional area and has a process, so it's very, very clear to the top team exactly how the levy is being spent. So when we talk about how you can use your levy, as I said before, for many employers, it will be for existing staff. And I think what this slide really shows is exactly how you can start to set out your use of the levy. And it's probably worth mapping some of the key areas of where you can start to attract interest. So at the heart of this is your total levy pot and how much you're banking each month, and as we know, losing each month if there are unused levy funds in there. So at the top there is early careers. Lots of employers have annual pipeline where they're bringing in new entrants. That's a very quick win, a very easy win if you're doing that anyway. But actually, when you look at the professional qualifications, there could be lots of people within your business that are doing professional qualifications. You're paying quite expensive costs in order for them to do a project management qualification, or if it's HR, or if it's procurement. I think what's great about some of these standards is that where they're linked to a professional qualification, you can start to look at your professional functions, for example, and see where that could map to an apprenticeship. The second area where you could look to is around improving performance, particularly within an operational environment. So is there a performance issue that you need to address? You know, will the apprenticeship improve overall efficiencies? What kind of standards are out there that are going to be at the right level to support your improvement managers, for example? I mean, these are really interesting standards, I think, and more employers are now looking to the apprenticeship route to looking at performance management. Learning and development. A piece of work that I did was around any learning and development requests that come into HR. You know, we would look at them individually and we would consider, actually, could that piece of L&D be mapped to an apprenticeship? And it could be anything from somebody wanting to do a project management course, for example. You know, would we want to spend, you know, thousands of pounds sending someone on a Prince 2 course? Not that I'm promoting Prince 2, there are others available, shall we say, where actually, you know, that can be mapped to the level for project management. So there are lots of ways in which you can look at your L&D requests. When you start to show to finance, for example, what they're saving around apprenticeships and use of the levy as opposed to expensive L&D courses, that is really when the steering board will start to sit up and actually take notice in terms of its use and effectiveness. So high potentials, your HR business partners should know who your hypos are, and actually, you know, looking at your hypos and seeing whether or not the levy could be used to develop the potential of your workforce. So not only will that keep hold of your good people, it will also ensure that they are progressing in the right direction. And the final area is high performance. You know, your next generation of leaders. There's some fantastic apprenticeship standards out there, your level 6, your level 7, your masters, for example, that will really, you know, retain and drive, you know, that high performance of your next generation of leaders. We had a question last week actually around should the levy be used for these level 7 courses, apprenticeships where you've got some very well paid, you know, senior leaders on these programs. One for discussion, I think.
Yes, I think certainly it's one that's happening from a discussion point of view. It's definitely happening at a ministerial level and at department level. And it would not surprise me if sometime in the next year or so we hear about changes in that area about how it may be funded, because a lot of the apprenticeship levy is being spent on those high performing sort of and high level apprenticeships and degrees. And I think there's a concern there about the need for the sort of more level 4, level 5 apprenticeships, because there is an awful lot of need in the market for level 4, level 5 technical qualifications and technical knowledge. So I think initially the government wanted the apprenticeship levy to be spent in those areas. So it'll be one to watch definitely, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's changes in that area later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of leads you nicely onto the next slide, because from my own experience, you know, you can kind of talk about the positives of apprenticeships and where you can map, you know, the opportunities, etc. But there are some pitfalls, I think, and somebody asked a question. So I did want to sort of pick this up on this slide. So I suppose even though, you know, the apprenticeship can be used for existing staff, you need to make sure that it's the right solution, because even though you can draw on the levy to pay for the training, there will still be a cost to you to do that apprenticeship. Things like backfill costs, time off the study days. So you need to make sure it's the right route for you. And this really is what this slide actually covers. So I suppose before you launch into saying, yeah, an apprenticeship is the solution, try to think about, well, what is the issue you're trying to solve? Is it poor performance? Is there a genuine skills gap? Is that skills gap an immediate need, so they need some training in this particular area quickly, or is it a much more longer term strategic view? Another thing to consider within the apprenticeship, is there sufficient new or enhanced knowledge, skills and behaviour in there to give them that stretch? Bryony's going to talk about recognition of prior learning later on. I think the other thing that you need to consider is, once you decide to do these apprenticeships, and maybe you're looking at large cohorts, then what resources do you need to make sure that they're getting the right support in the workplace? There's no point in launching a programme and not having the right support around them in order to make sure that they stay on the programme and that they ultimately complete their apprenticeship. We all know that people can get really excited about starting a programme, and then 2 years down the line, you know, they're finding that actually they've not completed their assignment, there are issues around performance, and all, you know, all that kind of stuff. So you need to make sure that the right support is in place to support them over a long period. Think about the fact that every standard now is a minimum of 12 months duration. Is that the right solution for you to solve the problem? So if it's something like, and I'm just giving it an example here, because this is something that I worked on personally, you know, if you've got an issue around improving customer experience, then is a 12-month programme or 15-month programme on the customer service practitioner the right solution? If it is, then fantastic, but if it isn't, and you need some short, sharp interventions, then maybe just consider it's the right solution. In terms of impact, obviously, you know, I think it's really, really good practice, and this comes back to the work of the steering board and the project board and the working groups, is making sure that you can reflect and look back at what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well. So if you are looking at large cohorts, really dig deep and actually try to find out, has this worked? Has it helped our organisation? What kind of return on investments are we starting to see within that particular function? And again, you know, look at the metrics as well. So we know all of them. In fact, we did a webinar last week all around return on investment, and it is available on our website. So if you want to have a look at that, then that's absolutely fine. But I think, you know, really look at the metrics. If you can demonstrate, so for example, improving performance, that as a result of that apprenticeship, then you can genuinely see an improvement in performance in that particular function, then that's the kind of metrics that you want to really be evaluating. And you may not see that for 6 to 9 months, but I think it's worth identifying what those metrics are. I think, is there a progression route? Obviously, from my own experience, people are very incentivized if they think their apprenticeship is going to help them progress into more leadership type roles. So within operations, obviously you've got some really good progression pathways into team leading, operations level 5, and then senior leadership. So I think you need to be mapping out exactly what that progression route looks like in order to have that full career progression available for your people. So I'm going to hand back over to Bryony now, who's going to talk about RPL.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. It leads nicely into this because as part of your assessment of things to consider for your current staff, particularly in terms of apprenticeship, one of the needs of one of the funding rules that have been put in place by the ESFA with regards to starting new apprenticeships inside your organisation is recognising and assessing any prior learning. Because as far as the government and DfE and Education and Skills Funding Agency are concerned, the levy or any co-investment must not be used to pay for or accredit any learners' existing knowledge, skills and behaviours. So if you are, this is particularly apt when you're looking at current staff. For new staff, it still has to be assessed, particularly if they've been in another job elsewhere doing a similar role, you still need to look at them. Because again, you could find that some of their previous knowledge, previous skills and experience actually replicates what you might be wanting them to do in an apprenticeship. And if you're an employer provider, it's very key that you do this because the ESFA will audit you on this, and they'll be carrying out audits later on this autumn. But if you're working with a provider, they will also audit the provider. Now, there are benefits to this for you as employers, because if you're running at prior learning, if you're assessing prior learning with your provider, what the provider should do is they should reduce the duration and the content and the cost of the apprenticeship to you, the employer, if they find that the individual apprentice has got some knowledge, skills and behaviours that are replicated by the apprenticeship. So one of the things that should happen before you even start the apprenticeship is that yourself and the provider need to carry out a thorough initial assessment of the potential apprentice's prior knowledge, skills, etc. And then to do that, initial assessment is a real dark art, and I'm actually running some webinar workshops later on this month and in October about how to make sure that you are managing and recognising initial assessment prior learning effectively in readiness for ESFA audits to make sure that funding isn't clawed back. Because if the ESFA auditors find that you haven't assessed prior learning and then obviously reduced content and price, they will take away funding if they find that's the case. And there are various MIS data and reports that can help you support this. So I'll be covering that in that workshop later on in October. So you must carry out a thorough initial assessment of the potential apprentice's current knowledge and skills that they've gained, both in terms of work, but also in terms of prior qualifications and any previous apprenticeships. And just to be clear on this, if an apprentice has, for instance, done a level 3 apprenticeship already and they've joined you and you want them to do a level 4, that is not counted as prior learning because it's seen as progression. So progression to the next level of knowledge and skills will always be new knowledge and new skills because it's at a different level. So there's no issues there around progression from one level to the other. The issue is if they're doing an apprenticeship and they've already done a qualification at a similar level, or they've been working in a job at a similar level, that is where you really need to do a strong initial assessment of what they already know. And then your provider should work with you to agree what the reduction in duration should be for that particular apprenticeship and also what the reduction in price should be. So you should be negotiating that with providers and making best use of your levy to make sure that your apprentice isn't repeating learning and you're getting a good price for apprenticeship and not paying for something that actually has already been learned elsewhere. Just a couple of other points to be aware of. Where you account for prior learning and knowledge or skills means that the on-programme duration would fall below that 12 months minimum duration, or your apprentice would fail to meet the 20% off the job requirements, then that apprenticeship becomes ineligible and you can't go forward with it. So if you're doing a 12-month apprenticeship and you find there is some prior learning there, it's likely that you won't be able to go forward with that apprenticeship. So what you might want to look at is talking to your provider about use of their adult education budget, that's budget funding stream if they have one, and see if there are other qualifications that would suit your learner more that are not apprenticeship based. So there are other funding streams which can support you. Your provider will know how they work and who's eligible for them in case your apprentice can't go forward with that particular apprenticeship because they've already got prior knowledge. And everything that you agree in terms of prior knowledge and assessing their prior learning and carrying out that initial assessment must be put in that employer agreement that you have with your provider, and also in the commitment statement in the apprenticeship agreement. So both the apprentice knows that there's a reduction in their apprenticeship duration, and reduction in the content of what they've got to learn, and you and your apprentice and your provider have agreed that beforehand and everybody's signed it off. So what counts as prior learning? Work experience relevant to the apprenticeship standard or framework. As I said before, particularly important to check this for existing staff. Look at what the apprenticeship framework or standard contains. Look at what your apprentice knows already. And it's an interesting thing about prior learning is, you know, your apprentice may say that they know something, but you need to have a really in-depth, or your provider needs to have a really in-depth conversation about what they really know. Because quite often someone will say they know something, but when you go into it in more detail, what they know is very much an overview, and they don't really know the detail which can be learnt as part of the apprenticeship. Did they receive any in-house training, or have they received an in-house training that's pertinent to the apprenticeship standard that means they don't need to repeat it? And any other qualifications or any other type of training they've had previously in other jobs or within your own organisation is relevant, that you need to reduce content and duration. Just as part of that, I'm just going to flag a query that I got from an employer and a provider about 9 months ago. They were looking at the management apprenticeship, I think it was the level 5, and they had an in-house manager who they wanted to take through that level 5 apprenticeship. The reason they wanted the person to go through the level 5 apprenticeship is because they were a manager, but they were not particularly a great manager. So I had a long conversation with both the provider and the employer, and we talked about what that person knew. And at the end of it, we realised that that person knew an awful lot of the content of that standard already. The issue there was more about the fact that this person was not a particularly great manager. So I had a conversation with the year surveyor and the DfE and asked about this, and they said that's not an apprenticeship programme that's needed, it's a performance management issue. So take that into account. If you're looking at someone who's, you know, you're wanting to improve their work or improve their management, is it really a performance management issue that you're looking at, or is it actually that they need an apprenticeship because they just don't know what they're doing, or they don't have the skills and experience to be an effective manager or an effective employee in that particular occupation? So that's really, really key. If they're going to repeat learning just to make an improvement in what they already know, that's not an apprenticeship, that's performance management. So any previous apprenticeship undertaken in a related sector or subject area. So if someone has already done an apprenticeship in the sector subject area, there are some apprenticeship standards and some apprenticeship frameworks where there are crossovers of knowledge and skills and behaviours. It may well be that they've taken something in a related subject, but in actual fact that replicates some of the learning in the new apprenticeship you want them to do, and you'll have to take out certain modules and reduce the content and duration for that. And then also prior education training, associated qualifications in related sector subject areas, always worth checking the content of those particular qualifications to see what was learned. Does it replicate the content in the framework or standard that you're going to be delivering? In which case, again, you need to reduce that content, reduce the duration, and hopefully for you, the employer, reduce the price as well. So a few hints and tips. The first big question to ask yourself with prior learning is the apprenticeship going to teach your employee new skills, new knowledge, and new behaviours? If it's not going to, then it's not really an apprenticeship that you need. So is that apprenticeship at the right level for the individual? Do they already have qualifications or knowledge, say at a level 3? In which case, should you be looking at a level 4? Because what an apprenticeship is meant to do is give your individual employee push and stretch in their knowledge and skills and behaviours. So they're learning, they might already have some knowledge in that area, but they might need to step up to a new level of knowledge. And that's part of that whole progression that Pauline mentioned earlier, to get people into more senior roles as well within your organisation and working at a more senior level. As I mentioned earlier, are you hoping the apprenticeship will make the employee be a better manager? That's a performance management issue. It's not really an apprenticeship. And are you getting value for money from your provider in terms of price negotiation and duration of the programme, because they should be reducing the price of the apprenticeship if you're reducing the duration of the programme and duration of the content. Now, sometimes there are other issues there in terms of duration of the programme and content, because the provider might be delivering other content or knowledge for you. So make sure that your price negotiation is fair to both you and to the provider. And also, various employers have asked me about exemptions for maths and English, and does the apprentice they're putting forward really need to do the maths and English inside that apprenticeship? What I've put there are the government publication links to getting approval for funding, but also to the maths and English condition of funding. So this looks at what maths and English should be delivered in an apprenticeship according to what maths and English knowledge or skills or qualifications your apprentice has already got. So those two links will take you to that information and help you make a decision about whether that needs to happen. But if you're working with a provider, they should know this and they should be working through that with you anyway. So the other thing that we said we'd mention are some endpoint assessment changes for 2019-2020. And these are changes that are coming in the apprenticeship reforms over the course of the next year. We're not sure on timing because the ESFA has not been 100% clear about some of it. That first point with the employer being responsible for choosing the endpoint assessment, that's already the case. You as an employer should have choice about which endpoint assessment organisation you're using. That may well be that you've passed that responsibility over to your provider because you're more than happy for them to use their expertise, but you have to agree it. And you also have to make sure that you are happy or have negotiated or been involved in the negotiation for the cost of the assessment, because it's you that's paying for it. The provider might currently be paying the endpoint assessment organisation, such as City and Guilds, but you should be making sure you're getting the best cost for that. Now, from April 2020, the ESFA has flagged that. We hope it's April 2020. It's not been completely confirmed yet. The contract for endpoint assessment will be held directly between the endpoint assessment organisations, that's an organisation like City and Guilds, and the employer. Currently, it's the provider that holds that contract and pays us. So they would pay City and Guilds if we were carrying out the endpoint assessment. But there is a plan that from April 2020, that contract will be held directly between the employer and the endpoint assessment organisation. So it does make for a little bit more bureaucracy for the endpoint assessment organisations and also for the employer, because you will then pay the endpoint assessment organisation directly from your apprenticeship account, and the provider will be no longer involved in that part of the negotiation and that part of the process. So
if my client is reporting and saying, well, actually, what do you think the drivers are behind the government wanting to do this? Is it about getting that complete ownership so employers actually take that decision in terms of who their EPA is?
I think it's twofold. I think there's an element of that, the employers having ownership. I think in some cases that there are employers that feel they don't have enough input into the endpoint assessment aspect. I also know that in some cases that the government and the ESFA have been very concerned about the fact that a provider might be actually charging the employer full price for the endpoint assessment, but actually they're getting a discount for the endpoint assessment organisation. So they are taking that small cut, whatever it may be. It may only be a couple of £100, but nonetheless, it's still additional money for the provider. Now, for providers, that's great, but it's not great for the employer. And this is meant to be an employer-driven system. And I know that there are providers out there that are concerned about this, because obviously in some cases it's a challenge to deliver some of the apprenticeships at the funding rate that they've got. Yeah. And there's a lot of noise about that out in the system, yeah, and about some of the funding bank cuts that the Institute for Apprenticeships have recently made and are continuing to make. So it's an interesting one, but I think a lot of that is about making sure that there's value for money occurring inside the apprenticeship levy and the use of the apprenticeship levy. Now, the other one that's interesting is from October the 1st, the ESFA will no longer fund an apprenticeship if there is no endpoint assessment organisation registered on the register of an endpoint assessment organisation, or an endpoint assessment organisation, so I'm going to call that EPAO because it's such a long-winded, the acronym so much easier. So EPAO has committed in principle to provide end assessment. Now, this is an interesting one. So if you are thinking about starting an apprenticeship standard after 1st of October, but there's no EPAO on the register or that was committed to provide that assessment, you cannot start that apprenticeship because the ESFA will not fund it. Now, there are all sorts of things here. If an EPAO is committed in principle, it means that they are in the process of going through the registration to deliver that endpoint assessment. and they should be able to do that within a sort of 3 to 6 month period. I mean, City and Guilds does this all the time. We look at end assessments, we decide whether we've got the skills, the knowledge and the expertise, we can get good enough staff to be able to deliver that end assessment effectively to the sort of quality level that we expect of ourselves and expect for our providers and our employers. And then we commit in principle to do it, and we go through the process via the ESFA Bravo system to become an endpoint assessment organisation for that particular end assessment. So if there's someone that's committed in principle, you're okay. If, however, you go onto the register and you see that there is an endpoint assessment organisation registered, it's potentially not one that you want to use, but there is a committed in principle end assessment, such as City and Guilds organisation, looking to provide that end assessment, then you can wait for that committed in principle end assessment to deliver, and you will still get funded there. So as long as there's an EPA registered and the ASFA department know that end assessment can take place at the end of the apprenticeship, then they're happy for you to go ahead. But you don't have to necessarily register with the endpoint assessment organisation that's registered. You can wait for a committed in principle end assessment organisation to get through that process and provide end assessment. All the ESFA and the Department of Education are concerned about is that there is the availability for end assessment at the end of the apprenticeship, and it can take place, so that if within 3 months of end assessment or gateway being required, you have got an organisation that can do it for you, even if it's maybe not one that you would want to use. So the other thing that's come up in the funding rules recently is that providers and employers must inform the endpoint assessment organisation 3 months before gateway that end assessment is needed. The reason for that is that end assessment organisations need time to plan, make sure that we've got the staffing, make sure we've got the resources that we can do an effective end assessment, and we can do it at the date that you need. If you come to an endpoint assessment organisation 2 weeks beforehand, they are really going to struggle to provide end assessment for you. And it also gives you time to make sure that you've got all the evidence that you need for endpoint assessment, and you can give that to the EPAO at the gateway time, so they can then book your end assessment within the set period that you've agreed. Because if we don't have the evidence, we cannot book the end assessment. So it gives you time also to make sure that your evidence is there. So actually naming an endpoint assessment organisation in the ILR, you can do that at any time. If you know who your end assessment organisation is in your ILR data return to the ESFA or your provider's ILR data return, you should be putting the EPAO identifier onto your ILR record at that point. But if you're waiting for a committed in principle end assessment organisation, you don't have to put it on the ILR, because you can wait until they've been approved, and then you can add it to your ILR record later on in the duration of that particular apprenticeship. So you only need to include the EPAO identifier where it's feasible and available, but you can wait if you're waiting for someone to get through that process, for an EPAO to get through that registration process. And another question that comes up all the time is, what is a suitable amount of time for additional learning before a retake of endpoint assessment if your apprentice has failed? And we get that question all the time, and it's not really one that we can answer, because it's really down to you and the provider to assess where you think the apprentice has failed with that end assessment, and how long do they need to maybe restudy or gem up on that knowledge that they didn't have, which meant that they failed, to ensure they pass at the second attempt. So that's really a question that's between you and your provider to look at what's happened, look at what's occurred, talk to the apprentice, find out where you think they might have fallen down, and then make decisions about how much more time is needed to actually get them up to speed so they're ready to go for a second retake, or to go for a retake or a second attempt, to make sure they actually pass on the second attempt. And there are just some notes there about the endpoint assessment evidence back requirements, because there is information inside the EPA that for EPA that you must include in your evidence pack. I'm not going to go through it in any great detail, but it's key evidence that must be there to make sure that when the ESFA come in and audit you, that you're ready and that there's not going to be any problems with your audit. And evidence of payments made to the EPA organisation conducting endpoint assessment has to be there, copy of the contract, signed statement between the employer and provider, and also some of that might be part of your gateway requirements for evidence that you need to give the endpoint assessment organisation as well. So now I'll pass over to Paula just to finish off.
Okay, thanks, Bryony. So back to me. So I'm going to talk to you about providers. Now, if you were in the situation that I was in my previous organisation, you will be managing, if you've got a big learning pot, around 10, maybe 15 providers, because the standards, what they offer is Some of the standards are quite niche, so not every provider is going to be in the market to deliver that. So predominantly you will be working with lots of different providers delivering different apprenticeship standards. So I think it's really important to just reflect on how do you find the right provider. I mean, in some cases, there may just be one or two providers that are delivering a very niche standard. But for something as big as ops management or project management, there's a lot of providers in that market. So what do you look for and what are the things that you need to consider? Well, for me, I think it's very much around, we'll look at the track record of delivering that standard. And we know actually that isn't always an option because some of these standards are very, very new. But actually, have they got a track record in delivering something in that particular field? Another thing that you need to check is, when you do work with that provider, are they going to look towards minimum cohort? So are you able to just sign up, one individual, or are they looking for you to sign up several individuals before they can make it viable to go ahead? These are the sorts of questions that I would be asking when choosing your provider. Another interesting question is, what is the ratio of apprentices to tutors? It's a really critical question to ask because you want to make sure that the tutor hasn't got a huge caseload of apprentices to go out and see across the country, because what are the chances that they're going to be able to see your apprentice regularly in the way that you want them to? So really try and ask these significant questions. You can also check, what is their success rate? You can find that out quite easily through the IFA website on the Search a Provider tool. But also question their delivery methods. I mean, we know the government has reduced the funding on some of these standards, so some providers are now choosing to deliver their apprenticeship through virtual methods, which is fine, but I think you need to question, is that the right delivery method for your people? Some people like to work in a classroom environment where they can work with colleagues, they can work with mixed cohorts, for example, where they can really bounce ideas, etc. Other people may prefer a much more virtual option. So do question how they will be delivering that for you. Another question is around, can they bespoke the programme? So a lot of these programmes will come off the shelf, as it were. So you need to really sit down and work out whether that's going to be fit for purpose. Will they be able to use some of the language that you use, some of your values? Will they be able to actually bespoke some of the training so it really means something to your staff within the context of your organisation? And are you able to map anything in order to make that standard live better within your organisation? So things like any induction materials, any training days that you're already doing that could potentially map into that particular standard. This works quite well for areas such as operations management, team leading, where you may be taking people off site anyway to do some training. Can that be mapped into the standard, which will also support 20% off the job as well? So just looking at some practical things, when you are looking at around, signing up a huge cohort or maybe 15 or 20 people, for example, then if you are a large organisation, you are geographically dispersed, really start to ask the questions around how the sign-up is going to happen. It sounds really basic and really practical, but it's an important piece of information because you need to know how the sign-up is going to happen, because they can only happen in a certain way in order for the provider to get the right information and do the eligibility checks. So find out exactly how they're going to do that. In most cases, they will need to come to the site and sign them up physically. So really just dig deep and check out exactly how they're going to do that. Also looking at the functional skills, you will not, from my experience, trying to get evidence that people have got their level 2 or equivalent GCSE, for example, has been quite challenging. Many people don't have certificates, for example. And in that case, then we'll have to do a test in order to assess where they are. Just make sure that whole conversation is fleshed out so everybody understands exactly what is expected of them. Because for many people, if they've not done last minute for quite some time, and they are, let's say, an experienced member of the organisation, it may actually put up some barriers. So do check some of these practical questions before you launch into implementation. MI reporting, this is a significant piece of work. If you're working with several providers, they will all be sending you reports probably at different times. Some of the large employers that I've spoken to, it's an absolute challenge for them to then consolidate all of that MI data in order to report it to their steering board in terms of how their people are performing on their apprenticeship programs. So really try and understand exactly how the MI reporting is going to happen, what kind of portals you'll be accessing, and can you always get any consistency across your providers in terms of when they report and how they report. Things like, communicating with line managers. So obviously the provider's role obviously is to come in and deliver the training and provide the tutor support. but we know that the line manager has a significant responsibility in making sure that they take part in some of these one-to-ones to really look at progress. What visibility are you getting as a central apprenticeship team that these conversations are happening with the line manager? So really try and think about that, and are there any SLAs in place so it's really clear between the apprentice, between the line manager and between the training provider that there is regular contact in place. And I think ultimately I would say this is a partnership approach. You do need to develop trust with your training provider, because for me it's a long-term relationship, and that's how you can work best with them, when actually you have a much more positive relationship that is longer term and a little bit more strategic in the longer term. However, if you wanted to think about, well, do you know what, we can do this ourselves, think about in-house delivery. More and more employers are moving towards an employer-provider status, because it gives employers the greater ownership over how their training is delivered and designed, and has a much more bespoke feel. It feels and looks like an in-house apprenticeship program. So an example of this, more and more employers are looking towards delivering their own team leading apprenticeship and operations management apprenticeship program, because they're doing it anyway. So actually, let's do it ourselves. So what I thought I'd just talk to you about is the resource implications. And before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of a poll, really, just to say we have run in the past how to apply to become on the register of approved apprenticeship training providers. If this is something that would be of interest to you as a large employer or a small employer, let us know, and we can maybe put on a webinar to address some of that. Would you say, Bryony?
Yeah, if you do it via the chat and just say yes, we'd like a webinar on how to apply to the register of apprenticeship training providers, then we can look at numbers, and then if we think it's needed and it's going to help, then pour on our one. Yeah,
definitely, yeah. And as I say to you, more and more employers are coming onto the register, on a monthly basis. But some of the things that you'll need to consider, and I spend a lot of time speaking with large employers about the fundamental principles of what is involved. So this slide doesn't go into huge detail as to what's involved, but it gives you almost an idea as to the sorts of things that you'll need to be thinking about, and the sort of infrastructure that you need to have within your organisation. So key to all of this is a quality manager, so somebody within your organisation that can look at self-inspection reports, develop a quality improvement plan, and has an oversight and ownership of that quality delivery. So that particular role is exceptionally important, and it's a requirement from Ofsted as well. The second piece is around MI. So obviously, once you become an employer provider, you will be responsible for providing monthly data returns to the ESFA, and it's really important that. Sorry, did I not change that slide then?
No,
sorry, apologies, everybody.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm here.
I was getting so carried away, etc. So the MI piece is something that you would have to comply to the SFA, and to make sure that you've got the right people within your teams that can look at the MI. So what kind of MI manager would you want in your organisation in order to make sure that you'll be completely compliant? I think platforms and systems, you will be responsible for how your learners are progressing within their apprenticeship. So looking at e-portfolios, for example, learning assistants. The e-portfolio is a critical tool that will obviously track the progression of your apprentices, but also will help to record and manage the 20% off the job as well. What does your programme content look like? Looking at some of the standards and looking at the endpoint assessment, how are you going to make sure that the programme is going to help them to get to the gateway? Looking at the endpoint assessment from the outset in terms of what they're going to need to do and to show and to prove. Also, how are you going to draw down your levy funding as a result of your in-house delivery? So these systems will all sort of come together really as an end-to-end apprenticeship platform, which will allow you to enrol your apprentice right the way through to drawing down the funding through the ILR in order to claw back whatever it is you need to claw back from your levy. Does Pivot do that? And what Pivot does is, Pivot is an apprenticeship delivery platform, and we work with an organisation called PICS that is our partner actually, and what PICS does is they actually draw down funding from the ILR, so it becomes a holistic end-to-end learner journey. And if anybody wants to talk to me about that, how we're supporting employees in that area, then do let me know, and we can do that. You will also have to employ your own skills coaches. So whereas the skills coaches that you would tend to see through a training provider, these would have to be your people. And I think what's critical is they would have to be skilled in the standard that you are delivering. So if it is team leading, then they would have to have the right skills in that area and continue to upskill as well. Again, this is an Ofsted requirement. And finally, that would sort of give you complete ownership. And I suppose one of the things that I will sort of flag now is that if you are new to the register, and I know that a lot of employers out there are on the road tab, but they've not started to deliver yet, we are running a series of workshops at the end of in October and November in Manchester, Wakefield and London, which is really around preparing for Ofsted, because the Ofsted requirements, the monitoring visits are changing. So we've got this support workshop, which is free actually for large employers, with Ofsted attending and some super employers that have gone through a similar experience and got some positive experiences to share around how you prepare for Ofsted. So it shouldn't really be a scary thing. If this is something that you want to do, there are support organisations out there that can help you. So if you do want us to run a webinar on how to get onto the road tab, then we can do that. So just coming on to the final slide, let's talk about success, because it's always nice to end the presentation on a positive. So if you have, if you are already involved in delivering apprenticeships, whether through a provider or through your own contract, then this is a slide that I would share with you to sort of say, well, really talk about it. So out of all of your apprentices, try to identify some ambassadors who could be the face of your organisation. So they could be current apprentices or ex-apprentices. And what they can do, they can act as champions both internally and externally. It's great PR for your organisation, great for your brand, to really show that you're investing in people and you have got these apprentices that can be the face of that. I think you need to look at potentially how you're embracing diversity in apprenticeships, really start to track how you're diversifying your apprenticeship programmes by attracting better among female candidates, particularly into STEM roles, which we know is a really positive image for your organisation, and make sure that you're communicating the success in that area. And I think culminating in all of that, obviously the National Apprenticeship Awards, they kind of run regionally, and then obviously for those winners they go up to the national stage. Think about the timescales of those of those application entries, and think about which apprentices do you want to put forward, or even as an employer, do you want to be put forward as an employer of the year, for example. So that there's lots of things that you can do to create good, positive PR for your organisation. And I think case studies, I think case studies are such a powerful way to really help people understand the benefits of apprenticeships, especially in areas where you wouldn't expect to see an apprentice. So let's look at unique areas, and one of the brilliant ways is when you start to look at some of the degree apprenticeships and how people are embracing the degree apprenticeship route within large organisations to get qualified. That's the kind of case that you want to be putting together. And finally, join our network. I'm kind of here really to develop and to manage and to support large employers. We're growing our network, and part of these events that we're doing is all about growing our employer network. So that's pretty much the end of what I wanted to talk about, what Bryony wanted to talk about. So I think we've got time for questions, or did you want
a little bit of time for questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll fire away with questions. So the first one we have here is prior learning. If a candidate is progressing from a level 2 to level 3 apprenticeship, and there are units which are exactly the same, e.g. health and safety, is this classed as prior learning?
Yes, it is. So if they've done, it depends on it. If you, it's a good conversation to have with your provider, also with your skills coaches if you're running your own programs. Is the health and safety they were doing, for example, at a level 2 previously, and are they doing a level 3 health and safety? If it's exactly the same module with exactly the same learning and content, you don't need to repeat it. So it's just check the level of their knowledge, because there are differences between the level 2 health and safety and level 3 health and safety. But if it is exactly the same content in that particular apprenticeship, then no, don't repeat it. Or your provider shouldn't be repeating the delivery of that, because they've already got it. So yeah.
Okay, the next question. What would you offer as a guidance of ratio of 232 apprentices?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, all providers are different, but in terms of a decent ratio, I think a provider, a tutor wouldn't want to have any more than sort of 25 apprentices or 30 apprentices, for example, you know, as part of that ratio. Anything more than that, I think, would be quite tricky. And again, I think it would depend where these apprentices were located. If they were all in one location, or if they were all in like a region, that's probably okay. But if they're dispersed across the country, I would really question how that tutor is going to be able to get to them all within the time frame that they need to be seen.
Okay, next question. Where can I go to get the provider success rates? I need to find the data there.
Well, on the find a provider website, recently the ESFA has included provider success rates for both Ofsted outcomes on provider. So if you're looking to deliver apprenticeship and you want to find out a provider, go to the Find an Apprenticeship Provider portal. You can register on there, and it enables you to look at the available providers to deliver particular apprenticeships. And within that, there is a performance management area which tells, which gives, first of all, outcomes for Ofsted. From the point of view of provider success rates, individual provider success rates, they should be able to provide that to you yourself because they have to have that data.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's any actual ESFA data available on individual provider success rates.
I think there might be.
I think we'll find out for you, and we'll do a short Q&A about this, and we'll send it out to you afterwards. So I'll double check that. But also, the Find an Apprenticeship Provider portal does give you information on both, I think, success rates and off-roll. But also, more recently, they've added in a feedback section to that particular portal, which enables employers that have used that provider to feedback how that provider's done in terms of their delivery. So you can see if there are any positive or negative comments about a particular provider on that particular portal.
I think we're sort of run out of questions almost. But here's one here. So someone really loved a webinar on how to create your own apprenticeship program in-house.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
We sort of did that last week, didn't we? We had to manage an apprenticeship program, or how to get employer buy-in.
Well, I think so they really enjoyed that.
Yes, no, this one's someone's requesting here, so they would really like a webinar on how to create
our own
apprenticeship program in-house.
Yeah, so okay, that is a great angle actually. So let's
we'll look at that for you, and we'll come up with a webinar. It means we'll have to develop it for everybody, but we're more than willing to do that if it helps to support you. Ofsted prep webinar would be an excellent piece. So the actual workshops that we're doing in end of September, October are literally about that. So if you can get to a workshop, great. If you can't get to a workshop, I think let Paula and I know, and we'll see if we can do something via a webinar as well. But if you can get to a workshop, do, because they are free, and we've got Ofsted there. So one of the lead inspectors is attending those workshops, Chris Jones, and he will be able to give you some really good view from an Ofsted point of view. So it'll be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's good for networking as well, because the employers there are all large employers. They're all new to Rota, and it'd be great for you to network with each other as well.
On that question with provider success rates, if you put apprenticeship provider success rates into your Google search or into any search engine that you're using, you may find that there's a Gov data link that comes up, so you may find it in there. So I would search online, but we'll look as well, and we'll get that information out to you. There is one more question here that someone has asked. It's a difficult one for myself and Paula to answer, and it's about why has City Guilds pulled out of the arborist endpoint assessment. I'm not sure about the answer to that. What I can tell you with regards to us assessing whether we can deliver EPA, we do a whole load of quality assessment ourselves to see if we can do that and do it well, and it's based around, can we get the staff to do it? From the point of view of, have we got the knowledge internally to manage it? Can we get the staff to do it? Have the staff got the knowledge? And are they available, and do we think we really have the resources to do it? But there's also the question of return on investment. Are there going to be enough arborist apprenticeships delivered for us to make it worth our while to develop all the assessment end assessment requirements and resources, and all the on-programme resources that we need to develop to support end assessment? So that will be the process that we've gone through, which will have had some contribution as to why we haven't gone forward with the arborist, but I don't have the full answer because I'm not part of the EPA team, but we will try and find out for you.
Yeah.
Again, the last quick one, can you send us a list of workshops out to benefit this?
Absolutely, we will do that,
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely, no problem, yeah. So we've had a really great response to today's webinar. We've had so many people joining, so thank you for all your support.
And your interest, yes. And we will be doing a survey afterwards, so please let us know. If you can please complete the survey, that would be great. But also please let us know, because if these aren't doing what you need them to do, then we will change them.
Yeah.
But also if there's some other type of workshop and support or webinar that we can provide you that will help, then we will also develop that and make sure that we're delivering that as well. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, once again, thank you everyone, and goodbye.